Columbia University. I'm also one of the co-founders of Black and Neuro, and NeuroRacism Day has been the task assigned to me for this past 3 years. I'm very excited for our journal club this time. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge, just as Paige did earlier today, that I'm joining you from Manhattan, a borough in New York City, land of the Lenape First People. As Paige mentioned before, there's this myth that Dutch purchased Manhattan Island for the Lenape in 1626, which created forced migration from their homeland. But as we know, Westernized history rarely recognizes the true stories of indigenous peoples. So the Lenape are the true native New Yorkers, and after our nearly 400 years, they deserve to reclaim their land. We are joining from all over the world, so I invite you as well to take a moment to reflect on where you are, the lens that you are currently watching this from, and your relationship to those lands and to the people who have and continue to inhabit them. With that being said, it is a great pleasure to introduce the author of the paper that we'll be discussing today, and also a great friend of Black Neuro in general, Dr. Jasmine Kwasa. She wrote, I'm not sure if we can throw the link of the paper in the chat. She wrote an article published April of this year called Addressing Racial and Phenotypic Bias in Human Neuroscience Methods. Dr. Kwasa also joined us last year in this panel, or in the panel of last year. And yes, we are very excited to hear all about the paper itself, but also discuss some of the most research-based technologies and some of the methods that we use and how those can be influenced by racial disparities.
Okay. Well, yeah, I'll just start. Okay. So I do have a few slides to share. So let me go ahead and make sure that that comes up. Sharing the screen, second desktop. And I do apologize to anyone who's seen me speak recently about this. I do wear the same shirt for most of my talks. I think it's very flattering on me. And I do tend to reuse this kind of cover slide because although I don't know the artist, I found this image online. I think it exemplifies the future that I look forward to, which is one where people of all different backgrounds, and here it's reflecting me. I see 2 women of color being able to use neurotechnologies just as easily as the majority of people do now. So, okay, I'll be talking about addressing racial and phenotypic bias in human neuroscience methods, which is the title of a paper that I actually served as last author on, but I was lucky enough to be drawn into and work with, and I'll share more about that. And again, I'm Jasmine Kwasa. I finished my PhD about a year and some change ago, and I'm at Carnegie Mellon in the Neuroscience Institute doing both engineering and neuroscience work and a little bit of neuroethics on the side. So I like to start with acknowledgements just so that it doesn't, get put to the end. My co-authors on this paper are E. Kate Webb and Arthur Eder, who are amazing people, great allies to the Black and Neuro movement. They were tweeting about this session more than I was even. And I just really like to acknowledge them because it was their idea to put this article together. And they asked me to join in because they knew that I had the expertise. They knew that I was a Black woman. They knew that I had the expertise and, knowledge about it. And we really worked well together coming up with this and making it accessible and taking it to the highest levels. So I'm really thankful for them. And I think they're here, so they might chime in if they feel like it. Thanking my postdoc advisors for letting me run wild in the neuroethics space. I kind of tell myself that I'm in 3 labs. I'm in the Kwasa lab, the Shane Cunningham lab, and the Grover lab. So that's a real blessing. I have other mentors in the neuroethics space, and then of course, kind of in the people of color in neurospace, and their names are listed. They're really inspirational to me, and I look to them all the time for advice. And finally, kind of the traditional thing. So my funding source, which is the DSPAN Award, you can please ask me about that. In the past, I was funded by SFN, NSF, and Ford. So you can ask me about those. Those are like amazing opportunities for people of color, especially in neuroscience. My family, the indigenous owners of the land that I'm on right now, which is the Osage Nation. And then, of course, Black and Neuro for having me. You all are incredible. And I don't think I would have even been a part of this article had it not been for the amazing Black and Neuro movement that's been happening and drawing attention to issues like these. Okay, so where in the world is my, okay, here it is. Okay, I had to see on the screen what I was going for. Okay, so here's the paper. It was in Nature Neuroscience, which is something that we're really proud of. And it's really about talking about these human neuroscience methods and how some of them might not be accessible for people with different phenotypes and racial identities. So just to be clear on the definitions, a phenotype is kind of what you look like. So it's like phenotypically what you are, not your genotype. So I don't care what part of the world you're from, but if you have dark skin, that's a phenotype. If you have curly, coarse, kinky hair, that's a phenotype. Your race is something that is socially constructed, but still has power, right? So while they interact and they have a lot of different overlap, they're fundamentally different issues, right? And so we focused mostly in this article on phenotype, but then towards the end, we talk a little bit more about race. Okay. So just as a background, neurotech, we're advancing so rapidly. We have all these amazing technologies coming out, MRIs, fNIRS, and even kind of portable brain sensing technologies. And if you're familiar with Moore's law, it says that there's exponential increase in technology development. So this was kind of started with silicon chips, but it's also true in neurotechnology. And it looks, as you can see here, for some parts of neurotech, we're actually outperforming Moore's law. So we're going faster than exponential increase, right? And so this is really great, but are the fruits of these advances accessible by all? And do implicit assumptions of the designers behind these advances bias potential users? And we think that the answer is yes. So why? And so in our article, we outline kind of 3 eras where there's this bias embedded in our neurotechnologies. So the first era is what I would think of as the historical era, the era of exclusion. And so this might be a little overwhelming as a slide, but essentially on the top, it's kind of like water, you know, the iceberg kind of thing. So there's lots going on underneath, but on top, all we see are advances in neuroimaging. So in the late 1800s, we have electrodermal recordings, kind of the precursor to skin conductance testing and lie detector tests. We have in the Nazi era, Hans Berger creating EEG, and we even have kind of the precursors to fNIRS coming out in the late 1900s, right? At the same time, there are all these horrific things happening, and even like Black liberation movements happening at the same time, right? So we have in 1845, the father of gynecology was experimenting on slaves without anesthesia. Fast forward to 2020, where we're just now starting to rethink, you know, these biased methods of determining who gets a liver or kidney transplant, right? And those were based off of slave days as well. So you can read on your own some of these things that are happening, but the point is that there was explicit exclusion of certain people, especially Black people, especially people who were dark-skinned, from medical technology development because of our history, right? So explicit exclusion led to issues in who is available to test and produce these technologies, okay? Then there's another era that we'll talk about, which is the era of ignorance. And so we called in the paper, this is like the era of colorblind methods. So I'll just read off here what colorblindness is. It's the racial ideology that the best way to end discrimination is by treating individuals as equally as possible without regard to race, culture, or ethnicity. And it's been shown that this type of methodology or thinking actually leads to and perpetuates racism. Okay. And so that's saying that no matter what we look at, like, no matter what we have coming to the table, we're going to treat everyone as absolutely equal, even though people have different needs, depending on what they look like and depending on their background. So this comes up in a science article by a colleague of mine, Achuta Kadambi, where he's kind of putting it in different pots. So there's physical biases. So we're thinking a lot about, in the COVID era, pulse ox, and how darker skin doesn't let light flow through as much, right? Computational bias in the AI systems. If you do a data set training on biased data, which we tend to do, then it's not gonna, the results will come out biased against darker skinned or people who weren't in the data set, excuse me. And there's even interpretation bias, which is kind of like some of those medical things that we were talking about earlier. So colorblindness is not the way to go. And we're going to talk a little bit more about specific examples in neuroscience. But most importantly, we want to avoid an era of what we call negligence. And that's something my mom always says, when you know better, you do better, right? And so we want to avoid being negligent to the issues that different phenotype and racial biases introduce. So here's a little easy kind of depiction of this. So in any kind of human neuroscience method, we have a brain response, we have a device that picks up on it, and then we have our physiological output, right? And so while we know that there's embedded phenotypic bias potentially due to, say, skin color or hair type coming through the device, we actually are finding that racialized negative life experiences are actually doing bias as well. It just doesn't bias necessarily the device, it biases the actual neural response that then gets picked up. And so I'll tell you in an example momentarily for skin conductance recording, for example, which is kind of the big example in our paper. A lot of African Americans who go in and do this testing, their data is deemed bad or unusable. And sometimes they'll call the actual participants non-learners or non-responders, usually when there's like some type of threat stimulus or a fear conditioning experiment. And so this is really terrible. And we want to avoid an era of ignorance where we're just going around and saying that Black people or African Americans or dark-skinned people are non-learners of something, right? That sounds kind of like the era of exclusion, doesn't it? So that's kind of the main outline of the paper. And we want to make sure that we're avoiding an era of negligence by looking at all of these different sources of bias. So the phenotype bias could be your hair type. If you have big Afro-textured hair, it doesn't work as well with EEG or FNIRS. There's cultural biases. So like if you're extremely obese or if you have certain types of things in your hair, you can't fit into a fMRI bore, or metal can't go into the MRI. So like if you have a Slade wig and it has metal pieces or something, that won't be able to go into the MRI, for example. Acrylic nails won't work on pulse ox. And then there's also racial bias, as I said. So there's traumas and how that can show up in EEG or even in skin conductance. And so you're probably thinking, okay, this is all speculative. Where's the evidence that we are actually excluding people on this? And so I've just put together a few quick slides that I'll fly through that are proving this. And these are all papers that came out in the last year or two for the most part. So my good friend Tamara Parker and her colleague Jocelyn Ricard at Yale have a paper. It's actually in press. We're working on it. It might be under review still, I'm not sure, but it's very close to being out, where we're showing that through NIH data itself, Black participants are severely underrepresented, right, in the human neurosciences. So that's one bit of evidence. EEG, if you're not familiar, it's when you put, these electrodes all over the scalp. And even in this kind of exemplar picture that everyone has in their slides for EEG research, this person doesn't even have a scalp, they don't even have hair. And that's the ideal for EEG, right? And so what does that mean for someone like me who has big, coarse, curly, textured hair, right? It doesn't work with the technology. And we're showing that even though it's increasing over time, who even reports race in their EEG articles, it's still not that great. And this is a paper I was involved in looking at clinical psych journals using EEG. So this is not just a research problem, it's a clinical problem as well. Thankfully, I'm a part of an amazing group at CMU with diverse people who are working towards this problem of EEG exclusion. And we have a patent pending technology that we're even selling that takes this kind of terrible technology and makes it more accessible, where using braids and using this kind of adapter that works with Black hair preferentially. So if you have more questions about that, I'm happy to talk about it, but that's not the focus of this. Okay, what about other modalities? So that's EEG, FNIRS. So I'm also working on a paper right now. It's due like in a week and I'm like kind of panicking. But there's lots of evidence showing that for FNIRS, so it's functional near infrared spectroscopy. You're sending light in at a source on the scalp, and then it goes through the brain and out through a detector. And what gets in the way on the scalp? We're not only talking about the hair getting in the way, but it's also melanin, right? And so we're seeing that melanin is actually, it's almost like putting on sunglasses in front of this source and detector, right? And so maybe there's bias, just like with pulse ox, and measuring your blood response, also there's this limit of how much data, good, reliable, non-noisy data you can get from darker skin in FNIRS. So you have a hair problem and you have a melanin problem. And we're showing that in these technologies, especially the light-based technologies, we did kind of a literature review of a few hundred papers over the last 5 years, showing that while gender is highly reported, people are not even talking about race, ethnicity, they're not talking about skin pigmentation, and they're not talking about hair type. And just as an aside, this skin pigmentation score is actually quantified by something called the Fitzpatrick scale. It is extremely biased to light skin. So not only are we talking about we're not reporting who's a part of the study, we also have a flawed method of knowing who is involved or what skin types are involved, right? So that's another thing to think about. Okay, why does it say that my next slide is blank? Because it is. Oh, okay, here we are. So once again, we at Carnegie Mellon are working on this. We got a Facebook or Meta grant to kind of work on making these optical technologies more inclusive. So we're working on both pulse ox and FNIRS and trying to find a way to use our EEG tech to move the hair out of the way, but also to rethink the algorithms and rethink kind of the light injection method and how we even interpret that. So that's really exciting. There are all these kind of engineering techniques, but we're very slow. And then finally, the skin conductance recordings. So if you're not familiar with this, you send electricity through the fingers based on the connectivity of your skin. You can show fear responses, fear conditioning, things like that. And it turns out from a paper, multiple papers show that Black Americans have less of a response. And while I'm not an expert on exactly why that is, I mean, it's amygdala based, but I don't know exactly how to fix this. We do know that people are, once again, reporting gender and age, but not race and ethnicity of the exclusion in this type of modality. So we know that African Americans or Black people tend to be excluded, but we're not even reporting who we're excluding. And so that's a kind of a catch-22. We're too ignorant to even know who we're excluding. And so, okay, I'm 15 minutes in. Let me just finish up by saying we all have a shared responsibility. I've talked a lot about different engineering approaches that are happening at Carnegie Mellon and kind of boosting my own, people. But we all, as neuroscientists, as practitioners of these methods, have a responsibility, right? So we need to talk to our journals, have them require and enforce demographic reporting just so that we can not be so ignorant about these things. And I would argue negligent. We need to talk to our institutional review boards, have them mandate some of this reporting, train people on certain technologies, and have them require certain numbers of African Americans or people of color or certain phenotypes into our studies. And then, of course, funding agencies need to fund Black scientists, fund projects that look at these types of issues. Especially, I'm really concerned about the skin conductance recording because it's not like you can move the hair out of the way and suddenly skin conductance works, right? It's something deeper than that that needs actual better, I guess, what is the word I'm looking for? Like controls and confound studies, right? And then finally, researchers on the ground, we need to be sure that we're actually using a racially, ethnically, and I didn't put it here, but phenotypically diverse group, right? So we need to recruit new neighborhoods, not just on campus, hire human volunteer coordinators. If this is too much to do for an individual, hire someone to do it. Time and money are worth it, right? Pay for the childcare, be available on evenings and weekends. I will say, I've been doing a lot of work recently on, excuse me, I'm kind of sick, on getting a lot of people with coarse curly hair into the lab to test our technologies. And I literally only run people after 5 p.m. and on weekends because that's when we're available, right? So I have to give up something in order to get this data, and that's okay. And then learn about what we call SEVO devices, which are the technology that I'm developing and eventually selling. So that's pretty much all I have. I did want to mention that there's hope. These are pictures of minors. I had them playing around with kind of our technologies, but they're really excited about the future. I tried to explain to them the problem and they were horrified, and they were putting together little LED clips to kind of emulate, good impedance for the EEG tech. Anyway, the point is we're fine. We're advancing with Moore's law, but Black and Neuro can match it. And I'm excited for that future. So thanks for your attention. You can follow me at Jasmine Kwasa, our lab at CMU Grover Lab. And again, my co-authors are here. And yeah, happy to take questions. I'm sorry I went a little bit over on time.
No problem at all. First of all, I also wanted to thank you again, because I know you're sick and it's hard to do these things when your brain's not at 100%. Since you ended on this hope, I do want to bring this idea that we have that comes back on Twitter like once every 3 months. And it's how much we need to fix the system. People need to stay in academia to fix it. And I don't like that at all, but I do love how much, I think in the example of VG and Etienne's paper on like developing a new electrode because it was a problem that she was facing. How much, this is more like, I just want your opinion on this, like how much do you need to disrespect the system, respectfully disrespect the system, and just not be complacent and being like, oh, I guess people with braids are never going to get EEGs forever. How much of that do you think it's necessary?
I think it's fully 100% necessary. I'll give a brief story about my own self. Worked in a lab at Boston University for technically 7 years. Year 2 or 3, I'm getting pretty good at EEG. I invite my mom and my cousin into town. My mom's cousin, she's older. We're all cousins, you know, in the Black community, but she's my elder, right? And so they come into the lab and they're so excited and they're like, can you run this on me, you know? And I'm like, actually, we can't because your hair is too coarse curly, like you're wearing a big ass wig. Sorry, excuse my French. And yeah, you're like, I'm not able to do it. I dismiss people ahead of time based on their race. And I even was screening people ahead of time. If your name kind of gave off like an African or African-American flair, I'd say, I wouldn't dismiss people, but I would say, by the way, we're going to mess up your hair. We're going to put gel in it. We're going to do all this stuff. You're going to have to wash it. It's going to be a big labor. So if you don't want to participate, like, just let me know now. And 100% of those people would say, I don't want to do it. And I thought I was doing a good thing. But that's why I really appreciate Arnell Etienne, who was the inventor of the Sevo product, the clip that goes with EEG and moves the hair out of the way. Because not only is she a brilliant engineer and designer and artist and just amazing person, but she was able to stand up for herself and say, I can't do this project in some class without there being a technology available for my hair type. And so it's imperative that we sit up straight, know our own value, and say, it is not my problem, it is the technology's problem, if that makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. Which brings me to a different set of questions that when I was researching more about this after reading your paper, I think to me the most infuriating, and it is what you brought up about COVID and the pulse oximeters, because of the direct consequences that this has. Like more people die because of this. No one was thinking about the skin color. And it also made me think a little bit more about colorism and how these things are not going to be in a binary. These things will not happen like literally black and white. When you were developing some of these new SIBO technologies, how do you think, and this goes into like all these types of intersectionalities, how much do you think of these spectrums of skin color, spectrums of identities, and other types of spectrums?
Yeah, it's actually a really big deal, especially with the FNIR stuff. So, right, so I was mentioning the Fitzpatrick scale. And if you Google it right now, everyone open up a tab and just Google it. It depends on which version you're looking at, but the way that they categorize, I think there's 6 different or maybe 7 different categories for skin color. It's on tannability. So how much do you tan, right? And like technically I like to tan, I like to go and get darker in the summer, but it's just much different tanning as a dark-skinned person than a light-skinned person. And so that's why we're really keen on the language of phenotype instead of race, because I mean, look, there are dark-skinned people all over the world. It has to do with your ancestral latitude way more than, you know, do I live in the UK or do I live in Jamaica, right? It has everything to do with your ancestral latitude. And so South Indians, Southeast Asians, folks in the Philippines, people, you know, indigenous folks all over the world are dark skinned. And it's really important to not just talk about race. It has to do with your phenotype. It has to do with all sorts of different things. So that's very important to be careful on the way we categorize people and making sure. I mean, we are even thinking in our group the other day about how it would be great to have, I think I mentioned this last year with Arnell. It would be great to have Rihanna and have Fenty come and kind of do an analysis on how light and how dark and what gradations are there within skin tone, right? So that's super important. And then, of course, intersectionality is important for all of these things because, you know, culturally, women have more hair like on their head. That's not obviously like bound to gender or sex. It's just a cultural thing. But it is true that, you know, this is a problem that more Black women or dark-skinned women will face, or arguably queer people, right, will face more so than kind of the white male stereotype. And so it's really about thinking about the margins of identity and thinking about like who would benefit from this. I've gotten pushback that's like, to your first point, why do we need this? Like everything works well enough. It's like, you wouldn't say that if white men were the people who weren't able to do these types of, you know, data collections and therapies, right? We wouldn't say that if the marginalized group was the white man. And so I think that's really important. I also need to charge my laptop. So if you want to ask the next question while I go scramble, that would be great.
The next question I had more to do with the interpretation part of these things. So with the skin conductance itself, I think one of the scary, me and my PI talk about this all the time. We think about the headlines. We think about like the ultra simplification, the NPR version of our research. And with the skin conductance, there is a lot of potential for the headlines being Black people fear more or less, Black people do this, X, Y, Z.
Yes.
How our audience is usually heavily trainee based, and we don't have a whole lot of power on like the final say of a paper, of a final decision on like an R01 study or anything big like that. Kind of ties back to the first question. How do we stand up and say like, no, I don't think this is the conclusion. I don't think this is the interpretation. Because most of the time we're going to be the ones crunching the data. Yeah.
It's something that I don't have the full answer for, but it's something I fear a lot. And it's actually what pushed me into the neuroethics space a lot more. There's so many ways to get a science headline wrong. And I mean, I've learned a lot from like Nate Harnett, who's one of the authors on the papers. He's doing a lot of that groundwork in the skin conductance world. He's at Harvard now as an assistant professor. He's a homie too. He's Black in neuro. He's awesome. He's doing a lot of that work. I think perhaps the way to do it is be a little transgressive and just write actual perspective articles, write actual ethics articles at those high level places. So once again, I'm going to shout out Jocelyn and Tamara, who have gone and they've done 2 different articles. One was in the Lancet, and it was a very like personal type of anecdote on biases in human neuroscience. And then they also have more of a kind of data-based citation-heavy version of the same paper, right? So they're having 2 different types of like, there's like a ethos, pathos, logos going on, if that makes sense. And I think it's a brilliant way to approach this because the data can say one thing, but then sometimes people are just drawn to narrative more. And so being able to kind of say it in a technical way that people will understand, and then be also prepared to defend it in a way that the lay audiences will understand is actually really great. And I mean, I tried to do this with my dissertation, but a lot of people nowadays are writing a layperson dissertation as well as a you know, technical one for their committee. It's brilliant. It's brilliant because then you can say what you mean and mean what you say in both ways, right? So it's something that I don't have the answer to. I don't know how to stop the media from picking up something and running with it. I mean, I'm kind of horrified now by the monkeypox talk. Everyone's saying that it's a queer disease and this and that. It's like, how does that make sense when it's let me not. But yeah, it's kind of interesting how things get misinterpreted so quickly and become policy quickly. So I don't know if I answer your question. I mean,
I don't know if there is a clear answer. It is just a constant struggle.
Yeah, I'd welcome people. I don't know if people are able to put in the chat at all or whatever, but if you have an idea, please put it in because it's a really hard problem. I think I'm going to shout out Nate one more time because his work actively addresses those issues, and the premise of the papers, even within the abstract, is we've seen in the past that people say that Black people are bad at fear conditioning. Let's disentangle if that's true or not. Just putting all the assumptions out on the table such that if someone reads that paper, there's no ambiguity about the conclusions that will be drawn. And even me, I had some trepidation going into writing this article, even because there's almost a eugenics interpretation that you can come out of it with, or like a phrenology interpretation that's like, oh, Black people can't do EEG, FNIRS, SCR. We can't do any of these things. And that's not true. It's the technology that is biased, not the people that are flawed, right? And so just being explicit about it, even in the first few paragraphs of the article, I'm defining phenotype, I'm defining race, I'm defining how race has power, even though it's made up, things like that. So just being explicit in your definitions if you can, I think is going to help a lot. And shout out to the science communicators. Black and Neuro is like really heavy on the communicators, and you all are doing a great job of making sure things don't get misinterpreted. So I'll stop there.
I am also very terrified both of the monkeypox discourse, I guess, and this neo-phrenology approach they're having. I see a lot of, I'm trying to take it to the fMRI field now because I see a lot of, this like walnut shape area of your brain controls all your X emotion, which by the way, we don't even have a definition of the area itself or the emotion itself. And you see a lot of these, it's still like 2022. Unfortunately, the Buffalo shooter was quoting like a genetics paper that was very recently published.
Yeah.
So we see the real life consequences of not necessarily bad science, not necessarily even bad written science. I think the genetics paper wasn't necessarily a bad premise. It was just, you don't think about those consequences. You don't think about what people can do with this quote unquote knowledge.
And there's also like a whole group of people on the internet. I've stumbled into a thread of like genetics articles that were, I guess they were just bolstering the ideas of white supremacy. And there was a similar thread that was breaking down the ways that people get pushed to the alt-right through these kind of genetics papers, neo-phrenology, whatever. And it was terrifying. And I see how it works. I see exactly how people could get put down that path when they read the papers in a way and in a light that, you know, pushes you towards the racist output, right? So if I could find one of those, I can post it somewhere. But it was very eye-opening. It's like just pure genetics articles that are leading people to these bad conclusions.
Yeah, and I think the horrifying part is that the article isn't the tables, they're not wrong, or if they are, there's the scientific part of it is not the problem. The problem is the lack of responsibility or the lack of even thinking about these things.
Yeah.
And you mentioned this a little bit, but I wanted to hear a little bit more about how I'm in New York. There's 1,000 research facilities in California and through all these big cities, these big multicultural cities. And when researchers do have any kind of ethnicity data, there's this great paper on neuroimaging in general that shows like no one does. And then when they do, and you look at that data, is like you live in Detroit and you examine 40 white people. How do we engage with the actual cities? How do we engage with the actual communities that these places are? Because I think the ivory tower effect is really, really big, and we're just going to continue to do these things if we're not thinking where we are.
Yeah. So that's kind of the shared responsibility, right? So, I mean, it's not like one day you wake up and the whole lab is Black RAs and Black grad students and Black, everyone, and we all suddenly just go into the hood and find our homies and, go to the church house and get everybody, right? That's not how it's going to happen. And so it's really the responsibilities of us and our allies to really talk and be critical about who we're bringing into the lab. I personally believe that the type of work that we're using in human neuroscience, with the exception of articles that are really about Black populations or about city populations, with that exception, most of the neuroscience enterprise is looking at a white brain, right? We're looking at white and Asian brains. And we're looking at high socioeconomic and high IQ white and Asian brains. And there's nothing wrong with studying those groups, but it's weird. As you know, there's this acronym, weird: Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic nations, right? Or groups of people. And so, sorry, brain fog a little bit, but yeah, it's weird, literally, and kind of through this acronym, that we have so many articles that are focusing on this one group because we put up our come do this neuroscience study down the hall in the psych department, and then everyone in the 101 class comes. We're not going into the community, we're not going into the city to actually get the populations that need to be represented. And so that's why I say you do have to start going non-traditional. You have to start offering childcare, start offering vouchers, right? Go into communities that are different, just make a bus sign or something like that to get people to come to your lab. And, if you're a lab and there's 10 people in the lab and you have a modest R01 grant as a PI, it's hard to do that. I understand that. But what if all the psychology labs and neuroscience labs in a department or in an institute come together and say, we need to hire a research volunteer coordinator, kind of like the clinical side, how they do it, how, at hospitals, they do this a lot. They'll have a pool of people, right? And then you can draw from the pool of people so that it's not so much work on just one lab or one individual researcher. Because I know personally, it's hard to go out into Pittsburgh and find all these people and maintain a relationship and do all of that. I mean, it's something that there are professionals out there who can help. And then, of course, when you do start to bring in more diversity into the lab of the people who are actually doing the work, that will come a little bit more naturally. I know for myself, I'm able to draw from the Black community better because I'm a part of the Black community. So that's huge. I do think it's super irresponsible when you have someone saying, oh, we're in, inner city LA, and it's like, 1,000 white people. Like, that's weird. That's weird. Like, that doesn't make sense. So yeah, I hope that answered the question.
No, it does beautifully. We're going to start moving towards audience questions. We already have a few. So one of them is, how can we educate scientists on how to gather this recruitment data responsibly? So how do we stop people from running wild with the belief that all Black people have the same skin color and hair type? Like, kind of back to the binary or the stereotypical analysis of this.
Yeah. Oh, was that in the Q&A or? Oh
yeah, it's fine. Don't worry about it.
Oh, okay. So the question is, how do we get scientists to stop thinking in the binary? Sometimes I think people in a majority don't think in nuances because they've never had to assess the nuances that they hold within themselves. So for example, I try to tell, I love my PI, she's great. Like, we've had a lot of deep conversations over the years about race and things because I was her first Black student. And I was talking about code switching, and she was like, oh, I've never had to do that. And I'm like, but yes, you have. Because the way you talk to your mother is different than the way you talk to the chair of the department, which is different than the way you talk to your kids. But you could talk about the exact same thing in multiple ways, right? So that's the example of code switching. But in terms of like nuances in identity, you could ask a white person, like, for instance, I'm from Chicago. If you mistake a Polish white person from an Irish white person in Chicago, it will be a South Side war. So like, there's nuances in everything, but people don't recognize them because they're not in that group. And so what I like to do is just tell people, or like tap into each individual's like own experience so that they can start to empathize with it. And it's funny because it's taking me back. This is stuff that I never learned through science. It's stuff that in my high school, we were doing like diversity and outreach, like, training and things. And my mom has a whole history of like diversity and education training. And it's like that stuff keeps coming up more and more because I'm realizing that scientists, because we don't have the social science and humanities backgrounds a lot, we're not taught to think in terms of nuance. So to answer the question, pointing to the fact that, like, you could take a historical stance, like Black people come in literally every shade. My great grandmother was what they called high yellow. Whereas like on my dad's side, I'm Kenyan on my dad's side, I'm African-American on my mom's side. My dad's side, they're very dark people. They're called the Nile people. They're from the Nile River, and they just come in like dark and extra dark. Think Lupita Nyong'o, she's in my tribe. And so when you identify that there's the Jesse Williams, and then there's the Lupita Nyong'o, and then there's the Denzel Washington, there are all these people, but they are all considered Black, then hopefully it taps into people like, oh yeah, they all do look different. They're not all just one thing. And then of course, as I said, just thinking about your own nuances, it kind of helps people be a little bit more, sensitive to differences between people, because Blackness is not a monolith. Like, we know that inherently, but I guess it just goes over other people's heads. So pointing attention to that and being clever with your metaphors and just having those conversations a little candidly is probably the way to go. I don't know. There's probably better ways out there, but that's how I do it.
We have a somewhat long question, but I think it's important. So it's from someone who's interested in neuroscience of suicidal behaviors, coming from Lesotho, the country in Southern Africa,
Yeah.
Which apparently has the highest suicide rate in the world. I also didn't know that. So the question is, to what extent are there racial biases in the technique of
predicting suicidal behavior using machine learning? Ooh, okay. I have a lot to say about machine learning. Let me read the question more thoroughly. So, it would be beneficial to apply the technique to bring value and healing to society, but the potential biases may do more harm than good. Okay. An article out there that describes prediction of suicidal behaviors, but, do I have views on racial biases in the technique? Yeah. Okay. So, this is true in the neuroscience space for for EEG and FNIRS and everything else. Whenever you have a hardware, a software, an algorithm, anything that is using race as a predictor, it is so important to have all the other predictors well thought through. Okay. And so what I think we saw in the skin conductance recording stuff is that you might have a big sample of Black people, right? So for example, the first skin conductance testing studies that were done that showed that Black people were non-learners and non-responders were done in the 1960s. I read them. It says whites and it says Negroes, right? So we're before, the integration, and, we're still in segregated times. And so had they gone back and asked how many people had PTSD, how many people had traumatic brain injuries, how many people had depression, anxiety, all of those types of things, they probably could have extracted the confounds and the modifiers that were present there. But instead, all you have are the categories white and Negro. So of course, you're going to realize that Negro people, they have a different relationship with these things, right? So this is true for the hardware stuff. And that's what we think is probably happening in the skin conductance world. The majority of Black people have some type of traumatic experiences. So maybe that shows up and it's confounded by race. But when you go into the artificial intelligence space, if you're really predicting a behavior like suicidality, you have got to be so careful about not just using race as a predictor, because then maybe you would predict that most people of color are suicidal or more so, right? And that's not fair. That's a condition of race. Of racism and not race, right? So it's important to look at the person's lived experiences, their socioeconomic status at the time, their socioeconomic status as a developing person. So I think there's I'm not an expert in this, but there's a whole set of factors that look at childhood poverty and socioeconomic status. That's a huge predictor of present day adult level symptoms. And just making sure that all of those things are accounted for in the model before you just rely on race as a predictor. I hope that makes sense. So yeah, I actually identify as a techno-skeptic. I don't think that machine learning and artificial intelligence is going to save us, but I do think it's a good tool if you have very thoughtful social scientists and behavioral scientists behind the algorithms and using them and thinking about them and thinking about the outcomes. And I think you should test maybe 50 times before you actually implement it. So that's my thought on it. I'm not an expert in AI, but coming from Carnegie Mellon, everyone takes a machine learning class. And my biggest takeaway is if your features going into the model aren't right, then you're not going to get the right result.
I love this. And just a plug in for ourselves, last year, the first NeuroRacism panel that we had discussed a lot about the biases surrounding AI, and not just in research, but in how your phone is looking at you, how FBI is checking you on every now and then. It's really bad. If you have a chance, go watch Coded Bias on Netflix. We had a panel, movie reception with the director. I think it's also important, since this person who asked the question is from Lesotho and not from the US. You brought the weird concept. I think it came from the behavioral sciences mainly, but it brings forth something that I think it's important to mention, that if Lesotho is a country with the highest incidence of suicide and you want to study that to ameliorate the situation, studying California is not going to cut it, especially if you're not looking at why socioeconomic factors are playing a role here. And one of the things that you also notice alongside with colorism is just 90 or so percent, or I forgot the actual statistics. It's from the 2010 paper, but majority of what we do is in the US or Canada or Western societies, and that is not describing behavior. It's not describing, likely it's not describing structural things. It's not describing anything about other societies. And I don't know if there is a solution to this, but I'm curious about your opinion, since you're just in Kenya, right? Like 2 days ago?
Yeah. Okay. So I was in Kenya for 3 weeks, and I'm really thinking about using the Sebo technology there. And, I walk into the clinic. I'm lucky enough to have 2 neurologists in the family. And I shadowed them, and they were like, yeah, go to the EEG tech, hang out, blah, blah, blah. And I wasn't so, arrogant to think that I had a solution for a problem. I wasn't sure if there was a problem. I walk in, they have an EEG system, and it works perfectly fine on Black hair. Perfectly fine. Now, there are other issues with it, and there's a lot of issues with the neurology system there. There's 26 neurologists in Kenya. My aunt and uncle know all of them. They have a group chat. It's a very small thing. And so immediately when I got there, I'm looking around and I'm like, yeah, this makes sense. Like, a problem that we have in the US, we would not have in Kenya, because everyone in Kenya, for the most part, has curly hair. And sure, there are other people of different backgrounds, like there are a lot of Arab, Somali people with different textures. But for the most part, it's African, very coarse, curly, dense hair. And so, yeah, it's important that people from those communities are the ones actually asking the questions and leading the charge on solving the problems and answering the questions. So I think that's super big. And I'm even thinking now about how there's access to EEG issues more so than the actual hardware, right? So how many counties in Kenya have an EEG tech? How many EEG techs are board certified in Kenya? My understanding is that there's 3, right? And so that might be a bigger problem than, the hardware or the technology solution. That's why I'm a techno skeptic, because we think we can go in and do a digital transformation grant and do all these fancy things in countries that have their own sets of problems that have nothing to do with the technology, have nothing to do with a lack of artificial intelligence. It has everything to do with access and with the remnants of imperialism and colonialism. And those have nothing to do with what neuroscience can do. It makes me want to drop out of neuroscience half the time. So I'm not pro that, but I kind of am sometimes in my personal life. So yeah, there are all these issues that are way beyond what we can pipette or what we can code into a script. So sorry, that's just the truth.
It is, and I sympathize with that feeling very much sometimes. We had a question in the chat that I think is a perfect segue. What was the tech that was used in Kenya? And that was the Sivo technology that you mentioned in the beginning. Can we hear more about all the cool stuff that you're doing?
I think I have the European super cold, so excuse me and my okay. So it was this kind of widely used system in all of the continent. I don't know the name of it, but it's Japanese made, and I can actually probably share my screen to show you what it looks like. But it's a sponge-based saline solution. So, in the US, we a lot of times use. Let me pull up my stuff. I can talk and do this at the same time. Yes, I can. in the US, we use usually gel or paste-based systems, which is why it messes up the hair. There's usually a net of some sort that goes on, or they'll use some type of tape to kind of adhere each of the electrodes to the scalp in the clinic, which takes a long time. It's really bad for the scalp in terms of just like health and safety. And it's just a nuisance to people with coarse curly hair. There they have a system where all they do is take a little like kind of cotton pad type of thing, and they dip it into saline, so it's just salt water. And then there's a net that goes over the head, and each of these little electrodes just dip into the net. And it's a very simple setup. It takes like 5 minutes. So let me briefly show you. Let me make sure I don't show anything I don't need to show. I have
So you're telling me it was not something 3D printed, made by AI in a...
Exactly. It wasn't that deep, you know? So I am not 100% certain this will show up, but yeah, here we are. This is what it looks like. So are you all seeing my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. And my cursor?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's this little thing. It has a little salt solution pad, and this part goes up and down based on hair length. And then, yeah, this part goes up and down based on length. And then this is what it looks like all installed. So there's this net, it adjusts in size. This person has straight back cornrows, and all the person did was kind of take these little N-shaped devices and plop them underneath this net, and it just stays perfectly. However, in Kenya, at least, they only do EEG for like 20 minutes at a time. So this doesn't have to be super comfortable. It doesn't have to be long lasting. And the saline solution will eventually evaporate. They don't need to reinstall it. It's just 20 minutes. So sure, there are other issues in Kenya, but the hair isn't the issue. So we have other ideas coming down the pipeline because of this setup. And taking it down takes like, I counted, it was 48 seconds. So yeah, I don't know how to stop my share. Yeah, hopefully that explained it a little bit. I also see other questions in the Q&A. I wanted to just briefly hit on those. So the first one was like, where can you find more information about servo systems? So we have I'm going to type it in the chat. It's called Precision Neuroscopics .org, or is it .com? I'm going to look it up and put it in the chat. And then we also have kind of an overview pitch for a competition that we won that explains it a little bit more, including our, let me put it in the chat right now. So this is for some Pittsburgh area innovation challenge. So that explains the technology a little bit better. And then Precision Neuroscopics is the company, which we don't really have that much information on the website yet. But if you are interested in purchasing, then you can come to me there or email me. And shoot, here's my email. There you go. Okay. And then the other Q&A question that was up there was, how would you like to see scientists report on phenotypes? Yeah, just being very explicit about Fitzpatrick scale, about coarse curly hair type. Even if it's a flawed system that you're reporting, just report it. So in my case, I don't like the Andre Walker hair system. So that's the one where everyone's like, I'm a 4C or I'm a 3A. Like that hair system, don't like it, but it's useful. So just report, 50% of our subjects were 1A, straight hair, and then like X many percentages were 4C, 4B, 4A, self-reported. And even in my work, I have the parent, if there's a pediatric patient, I have the parent report their hair type. I report my hair type because I'm unbiased, quote unquote. And then I have a braider usually working with us. And so we have 3 different ratings of the hair type, and then we take the average of those 3. And that's what we determined their hair type was, and that's what we're going to report. So that's how I would report hair type. When it comes to skin tone, report your Fenty shade, report whatever you'd like, report your Fitzpatrick scale, just something so that we can get an idea as a group on what we're looking at. So I wanted to just hit those 2 questions quickly.
Perfect. Yes. I think we're about to wrap up. I think that last question specifically brings up a beautiful thing, which is fund more people. Like, you need more people in science that are not just your standard heteronormative white guy. I think it's a takeaway from your paper specifically. Like, a lot of this comes down to the funny mechanisms to systemics and systematic problems that we have. And also just bringing in the community. I'm imagining that your braider is not coming from another, or maybe they are coming from another country, but bringing the people from your community, make sure that you're not doing all this research in a little ivory tower. And yeah, thank you so much for joining us again. If you want
Absolutely. And I could talk about this all day, so feel free to, get at me on Twitter, email me or whatever. I'm slow on emails right now because I just got back from a 3-week trip from Kenya. So maybe DM me or something, because then I'll just give you a quick response. But I love Black in Neuro because I will tell you, a lot of the projects that I'm working on, especially in the exclusion and ethics space, are people that I've found through Black in Neuro and have grown this amazing community. Shout out to Liesl Jones, shout out to all these people, Nia Nickerson, Tamara Parker, Jocelyn Ricard, Nate Harnett, all these people I've met or bonded closer through the Black in Neuro community. And I don't know where I'd be without them. And we really are changing the face of how science is done. And so I just am so thankful. Tiago, you're the best. Thank you.
All right. And we have an Etsy shop. I don't know if you guys could have time to throw it in the chat, but if you want a t-shirt, SFN's right around the corner.
Oh, and I just saw Kate Webb in the chat. So she's the first author on this paper. It was her idea to do this paper. Major shout out to the allies who are here, because as much as we talk about our, big ups to us, which absolutely yes, our allies help us get there too. And so let's not forget them. Obviously, we're not going to center them necessarily, but Kate's the truth. She's super dope. And it's really important to make sure that we have other people with us towards the end goal, right? So I'm so thankful for Kate. I'm so thankful for everyone I've met. And I did meet Kate through Black in Neuro. It was, I think, last year this time. No, it must have been a little bit before. It was one of the webinars. So look at this, Praxis. It's awesome.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for joining us.